Hello and welcome everyone to the webinar on A3 Thinking by David Verble. So it's a pleasure to have all of you here. I see that we have about 125 participants. My understanding is about 500 people have registered for the webinar, so hopefully we will have more people join in. We have a lot to cover today, so before we get into the meat of the discussion, I just want to share some housekeeping items. First of all, you should be able to hear and see the three of us from the LAI team on camera. So we have David, myself, and Rebecca. So if you're having any technical issues, please do reach out to us using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window. So if you've not had a chance to introduce yourself, please do share your name, your organization, and country using the chat button. We will have some time at the end of the session, about 15 minutes, where you can ask questions based on what David will be sharing today. So please do use the Q&A button instead of the chat button for that purpose. So in the Q&A button, when you click on that, you also have the option to upvote others' questions so that that question will receive priority for David to answer. With that, let's get started. David, can you go to the first slide, please? Okay. So the overall structure of the webinar, there'll be about 5 minutes of introductions. Introduction to who we are as the Lean Enterprise Institute, the A3 process, and also David. And then David will follow it up with 40 minutes of presentation and then 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So a little bit about the Lean Enterprise Institute for those who are not aware of us. So we are a not-for-profit education and action research institute based out of Boston, Massachusetts. Our mission is to spread lean thinking and practice around the world. And the way we go about doing it is through a lot of these products and services that we offer. So we offer educational workshops. We have a big community on our website, which is lean.org, through which you can access a lot of free content about lean. We also publish books on the topics of lean. And we also do offer summits and speaking events where you can learn more about lean. So now it's time to go to a poll just to kind of get a sense of what is the level of exposure that this community has with the A3 process. So the question that we have is, should show up on all of your screens. So please do select one of the options, and let's take about a minute to a minute and a half. So currently it's showing that a lot of people have experience applying the A3 process. Great. Looks like we've also have a lot of people who've tried dabbling with the A3 process. A few new people who are very limited to no exposure to A3s, okay? So 30 more seconds, and then we can just wrap up the poll. Okay, I'm just going to end the polling and just share the results with everybody. So we have a lot of people who have experience applying the A3 process, or at least have tried creating an A3 successfully. So looks like a fairly mature audience with the A3 process. So thanks for sharing your inputs, everyone. So moving on. So let me just set the foundation for people who are new to the A3 process, what the A3 process is all about. So what is an A3? When you speak about A3 very generally, it just refers to the size of a piece of paper, 11 by 17 inches to be precise. But when you talk about A3 in the context of lean, it refers to a process. It refers to a process and not a sheet of paper as such. And it's about a process that actually requires to do scientific problem solving using the plan, do, check, adjust approach. It also requires gaining alignment with your stakeholders, and it acts as a driving force to enable change and improvement within your organization. So on the screen here, you can see a sample A3. It's not filled out, but if you see, it takes the various components of the A3 process and breaks it down into the 7 components. So the first component here is the background, and this refers to what problem are you trying to solve and why is it important for the organization to solve this problem right now. The next section is the current conditions, which is all about gathering the facts about the problem. When does the problem happen? Where does it happen? How frequently does it happen? And it also requires deeply studying at the Gemba, the process that is causing the performance gap. The next section is the goals and targets, which refers to what is the performance gap that you are going to close as part of this A3 problem solving activity. And then finally, you have the 4th section on the left side, which is about analysis. Why is there a gap in performance from where we are, from where we want to be? And then when we move to the right side of the A3, it's about proposed countermeasures. So this is a list of ideas that you have gained alignment with your team and even your leadership on how to go about closing the gaps in performance. Next section talks about the plan. So have you gained agreement on these countermeasures? And in a visual timeline, it shares when these countermeasures will be implemented and who is responsible for it. And finally, the follow-up section talks about what was the outcomes of this A3 problem solving activity. Did we achieve the business results? Did we close the performance gaps? If yes, we standardize it, or if no, we go ahead and revise the countermeasures and do further problem solving. So the key thing to remember is it's not about the A3 sheet of document or about filling out the form that's important. It's about all of the thinking, the discussions, and the process behind the A3 creation that is the most important. So this is just a very quick primer on what the A3 process is all about. So with that, let me very quickly introduce you to our presenter today. So David Verble is our presenter. He has been a faculty at the Lean Enterprise Institute for close to 15 years. And more closer to my heart, he has been my own mentor, teaching me the A3 process over the last several years. A bit more about David Verble. So David Verble has been working at Toyota for almost 14 years, both in Japan and in the US. And he was primarily responsible for bringing the A3 management process from Japan to the US. So this meant that he had to create the first training program on A3 for North American operations. And since then, he has been applying the A3 process for almost 30 years now in various industries, such as healthcare, manufacturing, and services. So at LEI, David was also responsible for creating the Managing to Learn 2-day workshop that we offer for many years. It's been a very impactful workshop at LEI. And currently, David teaches the A3 management process, change agent skills, and also coaches executives on leadership. So with that, I would like to hand it over to David. So David, welcome. Please take it away. And I just want to remind, as David goes through, please do ask your questions on the Q&A.
Thank you, Jiku. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad you could join us this afternoon. These are the lessons and reflections that we're going to be examining. And I'll say right up front, I've set a pretty ambitious tack time for myself to introduce at least each one of these 7 in 5 minutes each, which means I need to get onto it. If you're already aware of these features, and we saw that a number of you do have experience, I hope it took you less than the 30 years it took me to figure out about them. What I'm going to do is introduce each of these lessons with a lead-in slide. Then I'm going to go to a visual that I'm going to use to explain the feature. And finally, for each one, I'm going to try to offer up a bit of my history that it relates to how I came to understand and get a sense of each of these features. That's the plan. We'll see how it goes. Lesson number 1. Early on, I got the understanding that the Pdca adjust cycle really should be thought of as the check, adjust, plan, do, check, adjust cycle. Now that may take a little explanation, which I hope to provide. But I will just point out up front, if you don't do the check and adjust first, then really all you got to work with is the solution you've already jumped to and planning what to do with it. So this is the visual, and here in the middle is our friend, all of us in Lean, the plan, do, check, adjust cycle. I'm going to just touch on it briefly. A plan means to agree on a practical process to address a problem or need. In order to do that, you have to do something that we in North America added, which was to call it the pre-plan. You have to grasp the problem situation and get a sense of what's actually going on. The next step is when you've made your plan, then you take action as planned and monitor to resolve problems that come up. And those of you who have made a plan and try to execute it know that you actually have to do a lot of problem solving to solve a problem in most cases. Toyota Japanese had an expression, planning is absolutely critical. Things never go according to plan. Check step, it is to see and evaluate the impact of the execution process and the execution process itself to see if you can reflect on their differences between results and what you actually expected to get, and is there any difference in the way you went about it. Adjust is then based on that grasp of the situation after execution to decide what actions need to be taken next to achieve your target or goal. Just point out that in the center of the Pdca cycle is a continuing effort every step of the way to grasp the actual conditions. You don't just grasp the situation once and then leave it. You have to keep going back and looking at things. So where does the Pdca come in? Well, if you look at check and adjust, what it can actually involve is you are identifying where you are, you're looking at differences between what you thought you were going to get, you're clarifying those gaps as a problem, you're setting a goal for the next step of your Pdca effort, your next cycle, you're looking at the reasons you didn't get what you wanted, and you set countermeasures. All of that CA leads into your ability to do a plan. My little piece of history. Nijiku mentioned I was involved in creating the first formal education for A3 for Toyota in North America. Reason was Toyota didn't have a formal training plan. And part of that was I was given responsibility of working with a Japanese manager in the plant to document what he had a team doing to solve a problem. I was also coached in this by the senior Japanese advisor in human resources. And so I showed him my plan, IA3, that I was working on. And his response was, do more. Well, that didn't help a lot. So I said, more what? He said, more legs, more eyes, more ears. Then I got it. I needed to go to the floor. I needed to spend a lot more time there. So I went to the floor. I contacted the manager that I was supporting by working on this A3, and he found me standing there observing. And I think there must have been a secret network that the Japanese communicated with each other. But anyway, he walked up to me. He said, do you see? I said, yes, I see, I'm looking. He said, do you see that? And I said, well, no, I hadn't noticed that. Pay attention. He said, have you heard? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, let's go talk to the operators. That's how you grasp the situation. You look, you see what's going on, and then you talk to the people. That got me started somewhat in the right direction, because what I, as a North American, did not understand about Toyota problem solving was it didn't all take place in your head. To follow on that, a related lesson is that the Gemba is more than a place you just go to see. There are people there at the Gemba who know things that you need to know, as this manager just pointed out to me. So all of you are familiar with Mr. Fujio Cho, I'm sure, if you've been around Lean for very long, and you're also aware of him giving advice, suggestion, almost asking, begging managers and senior leaders to go to the site of the work being done, go to the Gemba, see what's going on, see for yourself, don't rely on reports. When you learn things, ask why. John Shook later edited it a little bit to say, actually, before you ask why, you need to ask what. What's going on? What do I see? And then the third is show respect. Now, I don't think he was talking about showing respect for the equipment. I think he was talking about showing respect for people there doing the work. So I want to apply to Mr. Cho's question to his own advice. So why go see? Because you cannot know what's going on in a problem situation, no matter how much experience you've got, unless you have actually been to see this specific problem. Why ask why? Because you need to question what you're seeing. You need to be clear about what it is, and then you need to ask why. Why is this happening? What do I need to know more about it? And then finally, why show respect? Well, that's the most important one. Because if you don't show respect, and Mr. Cho was the absolute model of this. He was out on the floor when he was at the Toyota plant in Kentucky at least once a day. And he was talking to the people doing the work. If you don't show respect for them, they aren't very likely to share with you what they know that you don't know that you need to know. I think a story that helped bring this home to me, I was working with a company that had 7 small plants in the same area around a small city, easily accessible from the place that I was meeting with the plant managers to work with them on A3 problem solving and A3 reporting. The first thing I asked them to do was write on a flip chart, piece of paper, and post it on the wall. What's a problem in your operation that you are concerned about and that you need to do something about. And I asked them to share with the group what was that problem. I asked them if, are you sure that's the problem? Every one of them said, yes, I do Gemba walks. I know what's going on. I'm out there frequently. I said, okay, I'd like you to go to your plant. I'd like you to go to the site of the problem. Give you an hour plus. Go there, stand for 15 or 20 minutes, just observing what's going on. Then another 15 or 20 minutes, just ask questions of the people working there. Don't tell them anything, just ask them about what they see, what's happening, what they're running into, all of those kinds of questions. And then come back here. And all the plants were close enough. I think we accomplished that in a little over an hour. I had then each one of them stand next to the problem that they said they were working on. And I have to admit, I was totally amazed. Every one of them reported that either the plan was not what they thought it was, or the problem was not what they thought it was, or it was very different from what they thought it was. There is no substitute. Not just going to see is not enough. It's very, very important to talk to the people who live with the problem. They know things that nobody else does. Next point I want to make, feature of the A3 process I want to touch on, is in Toyota they have a saying, no standard, no problem. But I have learned that in fact is not the case. No standard is a problem. And primarily it's a problem, a big problem, because without a standard, there is no way to see what improvement's been made. This is a mess. I would say this is chaos in this scene. One of the things that's impossible to do, I believe, is to improve on chaos. You can go in and do things, but with that kind of confusion and mess and disorder, how would you tell that you're moving in the right direction? How would you tell that you're making a difference? In that kind of situation, in a chaotic, unstable situation, an improvement is like a drop in the ocean. It makes a splash, but it disappears very quickly. Fundamental principle of lean continuous improvement, lean performance improvement that I have learned over the years. Stabilize as best you can first, standardize as much as you can, and then work on improving. A relatively recent example of this, I was coaching a engineering manager who was responsible for a big project, developing a new product for a client, and a big issue that he wanted to work on was engineering changes after the design was set and the original plan for the production creation of the product was set. They discovered things as they were going along that made changes necessary. The problem was the engineers involved in the project were submitting those changes late, and submitting them to the client, the company they were creating the product for. And in the agreement, there was a penalty if the changes weren't approved, and specifically if they weren't made on time and the schedule that was laid out in the agreement. The penalty was maybe the company doesn't agree to the changes, or there could be a financial penalty. And this engineering manager that I was working with was fussing about his engineers, and he couldn't understand why they couldn't get the changes submitted on time. And he'd been talking to them and urging them. I said, let's go find out what's going on. let's go walk the process. So we started at the end of the process where engineering changes were submitted in the company and then sent on to the client company, and learned quickly that the person who was responsible for forwarding them were getting many late. And I said, okay, well, what's the process that's supposed to take place for getting these submitted? And he said, well, we have engineers that have different responsibilities in the project, and they're supposed to submit them. I said, is there any more to the process than that? He said, well, no, there's we engineers are assigned to do them, and they're supposed to do them. I said, then let's go talk to the engineers. What we discovered was most of the engineers who were given the task of doing the engineering changes were young, relatively inexperienced, new to the company. They had not been trained or given guidelines on how to do the engineering changes. And they needed information about the costs of the changes that they didn't have the experience to come up with, and they weren't told where they could get that information. So a lot of them were sort of stuck and didn't know what to do, and that's why they were slow in submitting these engineering changes requests. We talk about got to have a standard. And we think of standards as targets and goals and that sort of thing. Well, a process is also a standard. And if you set a target and don't give people a process that is a process they can use, and you don't help them become capable of using it, you really don't have a standard. You just have a target. And what I counseled to coach this engineering manager in doing was developing a process, training and all of that. All of that's part of the process. Next thing that I have come to learn, and part of this is reflected in a lean post that was put up, I think earlier this week, last week, I'm not sure, about the social side of the A3 process. But what I want to say here is that a majority of the work in creating an A3 is done behind the scenes, or if you want to think of it this way, it's done behind the page. And related to that, the left side of the A3 has one function, which is reporting what you've learned, and the right side of the A3 is for documenting agreements. And very, very little of that work is done successfully alone. This is another example of an A3, and I'll just clue you to how I think of an A3. It is a tool for answering questions. And those questions are answered through A3 thinking and A3 problem solving. And none of that work is done on paper. The left side essentially lays out what must be learned. And if you read the Managing to Learn book, Sanderson, the manager, points out to Porter, the young manager who has the responsibility for creating the A3 for performance improvement, that on the left side, he is an investigator. You move to the right side, it indicates what has to be agreed to. Every one of those items has to be agreed to. It requires an agreement with stakeholders is required. And on that side, on the right side of the A3, the A3 creator, the problem owner, has to shift roles from being an investigator to being a change leader, engaging, working with others to reach those agreements. And in the Managing to Learn book, Porter's manager points out that you now know more about this problem situation than anybody else in the company. So yes, you must be a leader, and yes, you must engage, but you also have the responsibility for advocating what you believe is best for the company in terms of addressing the problem. So I have learned to think about the A3 in two different ways, depending on the side. The left side reports what was learned about the problem situation, and the right side documents the agreements that have been reached for making changes to improve performance in the situation. Another example where I am, in this case, working with a specialist, senior specialist, new specialist, relatively new specialist in human resources, who is responsible for developing a new policy and doing the things necessary to get managers and supervisors up to the point that they are knowledgeable of the policy and able to perform their role in executing the policy. I've been coaching this young specialist who was very, very bright, had developed an A3, done excellent investigation of what was going on, what was needed, what had to be changed. And the left side of his A3 was good. The right side listed countermeasures and laid out a plan for execution. And in talking to him, I started, after we'd gone through the left side, and I understood what he was trying to accomplish, I started asking questions about the right side. For example, do you have agreement to these countermeasures that you have listed there? And I said, he said, yes. I said, the people that are going to be affected by these, do they agree to them? And he said, yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. So that was kind of a red flag for me. I went on to the plan. I walked through it with him, and I said, you've got a number of activities listed in your plan, and you've got noted under responsibility that several other departments are going to have responsibility for a large portion of the execution of this policy and this plan. Have they agreed to their responsibility? What level of support are you sure of? And he said, well, I'm assuming they'll do their part. It's their responsibility. And I said, have they agreed to the responsibility? I said, well, not that I know. No, I guess not. I said, I think we need to make sure. Will you take your A3 with the plan, and will you go to each department head or manager who is listed as having a responsibility, and will you get them to initial where their responsibility is indicated? I didn't hear from him again for about 3 weeks. He was out doing a lot of talking, doing a lot of explaining of what he was trying to do, etc. The Japanese term is nemawashi, which is essentially laying the foundation for getting agreement. He was out doing a lot of the things that he had not done because he was functioning primarily as a lone investigator. Done a good job of that, but he had not done the work that needed to be done to move to the right side of the A3 and get the agreements that were necessary for successful execution of the countermeasures. Next thing I've learned, Pdca, problem solving, everything from clarifying the problem to executing the countermeasures to follow up, is an experiment. And this underlying spirit of A3 thinking is that very little is assumed. Everything must be checked, tested, and confirmed. So, following up on our earlier look at PDCA, let's go back and take another look at it. And this is what's described as the scientific process. Jiku mentioned earlier that, in fact, PDCA is a version of the scientific method. You start out by observing what's going on and you ask questions. You form hypotheses, theories, ideas of what's going on. You also, with that hypothesis, have ideas of what will improve that situation. Then you experiment. The experiment is executing, putting into place the changes that you think are necessary for improvement, and gathering data in some form or another, looking at the data, reaching conclusions about that, and then deciding how you're going to act based on those conclusions. I'm suggesting that the scientific method and the PDCA adjust cycle are the same thing. Different ways of describing the same thing. In the plan, that is essentially where your hypothesis is described. If we do these things, the hypothesis is things will be made better. In order to get to that, you have observed and asked questions, as pointed out earlier. Grasping the situation, grasping the actual conditions, has to precede planning. So plan describes what you've decided to do and why. Do describes how you're going to do it, how you're going to try, how you're going to test your idea, your theory that doing certain things will make the situation better. Check is to look at what actually happened. When you executed it, how did it turn out and why? And reflecting on those, how it turned out. Why is it the same? Why is it different? What is left to be done? The adjust is then acting on the conclusions that you reach. What would you do the same or different? The assumption always in PDCA is that it's a cycle, and you are going to continue. And you are, after your experiment, you're going to make use of the results of your experiment. I had this brought home to me very strongly with what I have to admit was a great deal of embarrassment to me. It was what I call my real lesson in the PDCA cycle, in spite of the fact that when I was in Japan early in my career in Toyota, I met this guy named John Shook who tried to explain the PDCA cycle to me. In this case, as mentioned, I was responsible for doing the problem-solving course. I was also involved in pulling together a whole curriculum for preparing the new leaders and supervisors in the Toyota plant that was starting up in Kentucky. It was a big effort. We trained 400 or 500 people. And after it was done, the results were reported in the form of how many participated, how many completed, how many submitted a final A3. Then my manager, North American, said, you now need to start thinking about the next step. So I put in a lot of work developing another plan, and I was sent to present the plan to Mr. Fujio Cho, who was the president of the plant. And I laid out my plan in front of him. He listened very patiently. And then he said, as he was often did, thank you very much for your very big effort. But he said, there are some things I need to know first, some things that I need to know before I can respond to you about your plan. First, this training program that was created and was implemented, Was it done as we planned? Did we follow through on everything that was in it? Said, I know what the participation was because I got those results, but those aren't the only results. What evidence do the managers see that their supervisors and their leaders have gotten the skills they need? Looking at that, what was not achieved? Were any parts of the training not effective? Were obviously some would have been more effective than others. What's the lay of the land there? What remains to be done? And since you were the leader on this, what did you learn that you're going to be able to apply to the next round? If we do another round, what are you going to do differently in it than you did in the first to help assure the results we need? I had no answers. And he said, okay, please do a check and report on the first program that we did. And when we look at it and when we know that the first program is finished, then we will look at the second. And I said, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And I sort of snuck out of the room because I was significantly embarrassed. I had been teaching Pdca, but I hadn't done it. Check, adjust, plan, do, check, adjust is the scientific method. This lesson is that the real purpose of the Pdca process is not just to solve a problem. It is to build the capability for sustainable performance into the operation. And that only comes from completing the Pdca cycle with check, adjust, and standardize. What is performance capability? Well, every operation sets up processes and equipment and technology of some kind, and then puts people in there and wants them to perform in a certain way to get certain results. Toyota's thinking is a little different, as I learned it. They look at the responsibility on management of setting up capable processes and assuring that the people in the processes have the capability to perform their work. They want consistent performance, hence the focus on standardization, because they want consistent results. The thinking is, once we've gone to the effort of solving out a problem and improving performance, we don't have to do this again. We want what we have learned to become part of our capability so we can get the same performance and get the same results repeatedly. The key is improvements have to be built into the process to get repeatable results. Another situation in which I was asked to come into a company, in this case, the management was frustrated because they really weren't seeing consistent results out of the continuous improvement work that was being done. This particular plant was a food processing plant, and its products went out in cans, some in bottles, mainly juice products, but most of it in cans. And I met with the internal continuous improvement leader, who was talking about all the Kaizens they'd done, and with a lot of, many of them they were very proud of, felt they had made significant progress. Particularly mentioned one in which they had focused on setup for the labeling machine, the machine that put the labels on the cans and sent them down the line. It was a problem operation because not all the labels stuck the way they were supposed to. They had, among the appropriately labeled cans, they had two categories called flappers, which one end of the label was sealed, the other end wasn't, and shiners, which had no labels. So he felt they had made a lot of progress in stabilizing that process. And that's, well, let's go see what's going on. We got to the big labeling machine, and there were people on either side of the line after the machine with bins where they were pulling out shiners and flappers and putting them in the bins to take them back and send them back through the process to try again. I asked him what was going on, and he said, well, this machine's always been a problem. I said, well, what guides are in place for setting up this machine so that you don't have this, so it is stable? You figured out how to get it stable. What was done to make sure that that stability could be maintained? He said, well, we created a setup guide. And I said, well, let's look at it. It was nowhere to be found. He was embarrassed and frustrated. And I noticed because the machine was producing shiners and flappers, a lot of the operators were tweaking the machine, trying to get things to come out right. Message: you aren't finished until you build the improvement into the way things are done, because that's how you get sustainable results. All right, last item. I suggest the A3 process is a way that an organization can get a lot of things done. I characterize it as being like the Swiss Army knife of business process. So here is one of the world's busiest visuals. In the middle, the A3 document, and creating that. Generally, there is someone who has responsibility and problem ownership, and generally it's going to involve some kind of process problem solving. It may be for performance improvement, or it may be for maintaining stability with Pdca process management. It may be for significant change leadership from a strategic perspective. And in that case, the A3 is related to Pdca project management. I suggest that in the process, not only does the person who has the responsibility need to be able to do the problem solving, they need to be able to do something broader, which I refer to as A3 thinking, and they need to take on an A3 leadership role. The organization management deploys responsibility to somebody for this effort. If you have read Managing to Learn, it is also an excellent way to develop the person who has the responsibility to do the job. It produces a lot of individual learning, but just as important, it can produce a lot of organizational learning that needs to be captured. And the best way to do that is document and build it back into the operation and the systems. There are lots of different types of A3s that relate to these different functions. There's the obvious problem-solving A3, which we're familiar with. There's also the status report A3, which is looking at how is progress toward the improvement proceeding, or how is performance going after we've made the improvement. There is also a reflection A3, which is essentially what Mr. Toe was asking me to do. On the other side, for change management, there's generally a strategy A3, which lays out the reason and the method for changing the strategy and how it's going to be done. And there is a project management A3 that's used to manage the project. And then finally, there's something called cascading A3s, which means you start at the top level whoever is setting the strategy or setting the goal, and they create an A3 laying out that and deploying responsibility to different people for doing different things, who then do an A3 looking at how the means they're proposing for achieving the goals and targets they've been given. And then that is often deployed now next level to people who are doing the work. I coached a new project manager on a significant new product, new model launch to use cascading A3s. It was a cross-functional project. A lot of people that she had no control over, but she needed to get alignment with them and follow through from them. She created the top A3, deployed parts of the project to different people, asked for A3s from them. They in turn were expected to get A3s from the people they deployed activities to. All of that rolled up into a good picture of what was going to be done in execution. And the project went very, very smoothly because everybody knew what everybody else was doing and everybody knew what they were supposed to do. Many uses of the A3 is the A3 process is all of this stuff and more. That covers the things I wanted to talk about. Jiku, do we have questions waiting?
Thanks, David. We have a couple of questions, so I've just kind of categorized them into themes, and let's just get started with those. So one question, or a couple of questions on this theme is, how do you introduce the practice of A3 thinking into an organization, be it an organization trying it for the first time, or leaders are not engaged, or where there is no culture of respect for the people?
Well, that's a lot of stuff to solve with A3. My answer, the short answer, is going to be from the top down, both in terms of the creation and use of the A3 process and learning the criticality of respect for people in the process. Now, if you can't get top leadership to engage in that way, I don't know how you get an organization involved in the A3 process. It has to be led from the top down, in my opinion. Got another one?
So, yeah, another question is, what is the relationship between A3 thinking and kata? Is it complementary? Can organizations have both at the same time?
Oh, absolutely. I won't claim extensive knowledge of kata, but it is basically a Pdca thinking discipline. And as Mike Rother originally described it, and I haven't seen all the later stuff he's done, it's a way to introduce basic Pdca problem-solving thinking to people at the operational level. It was not part of Toyota practice, something called kata, but supervisors, leaders did teach that thinking. And interestingly enough, it was a requirement for submitting a suggestion in the Toyota suggestion system at the Georgetown plant. A note about that suggestion system. The suggestion was submitted after you had made and documented the improvement, not before. So it didn't go into some great hopper for management to decide about it. And what you submitted was a very simple format that said, what was the old way and what did you see wrong with it? What's the new way and how will it address what you see is wrong in the old way? What results did you get when you implemented it? And is it still working? That was another form of what Mike later calls kata.
So another question, David. So another question a couple of people have been asking is, what's the relationship between A3 thinking and Hoshin Kanri, or strategy deployment?
Okay. Number one, Hoshin Kanri is the company level long-term strategic planning process that is built on the Pdca process at the highest level. Hoshin Kanri works by top management figuring out what strategically the company needs to do to improve or adapt its performance to meet the market demands and then the economic demands. That top level strategy is often defined in an A3. Doesn't have to be, there are other ways of doing it. Responsibility for executing that strategy is deployed down to the department heads, who then have to develop plans with or without an A3 to how they're going to execute things to achieve their part of executing the strategy. Those are then deployed down to, those goals are deployed down to the manager unit level and sometimes to the individual level. What I described with the project manager who used cascading A3s, that's essentially the same as the Hoshin process, the strategy deployment process.
So a person called Bahiru is asking a question. Is it normal to not achieve your target condition by the end of your A3?
Well, in Toyota, we learned to think of it this way. You set the target based on what the operation of the business needs, and you get the best grasp of the problem situation you can. You look at the underlying causes, you identify countermeasures to address as many of those causes as you can. And it's a good principle not to overload people, not to try to do everything at once. So even if you achieve the aims of all of those countermeasures, you may not address all of the problem. Also, even though you make the best effort you can to grasp the situation, there are likely to be things you miss. There are likely to be things that happen or don't happen in execution that you hadn't anticipated. So, as I said earlier, planning is essential, critical, but things don't go according to plan. All of that flows into what you look at and check and reflect and adjust. And because reality doesn't conform to our plans, that's why the Pdca process has to be a cycle, a continuous process.
David and Tim asked another question, which is, the A3 thinking is based on scientific problem solving, which is the
Lost you, Jiku. So if the rest of you can hear me, I think Jiku's got a technical problem there. I'll ask a question that I'm often asked. What's the hardest part of implementing the A3 process in a North American company? And my response is, I don't believe you can successfully implement the A3 process without people capable of coaching other people. And in North America, we had this struggle at the North American Toyota plants. The managers were not experienced enough themselves to be good coaches. So we tried to develop good coaches, individual people. I think that is one of the critical things you have to focus on. Ideal if the managers and leaders can be coaches. If not, then develop your own coaches. Are you back, Jiku?
Yeah, David, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I just want to follow up on Tim's question. So he was asking the relationship between A3 and PDCA. So on the A3, on the right side, we have the plan section. But his question is, isn't it actually the do part of the PDCA process? So can you provide some clarity around that?
If I understand the question, isn't the plan the do part?
On the right side of the A3, there is the plan section.
Yes.
Yeah. But does it actually relate to the do part in the PDCA?
Well, obviously it does. In the plan, you're laying out what you're going to do to execute the things you're going to do to execute, to implement the countermeasures. But if you don't have the plan before you start execution, then you're wandering around loose like all of that traffic that we saw in the picture earlier.
And another question is, what will be a good way for leaders to learn more about the A3 process so that they can begin to introduce it in their organization?
Well, this is not intended to be a commercial announcement, okay? But the Managing to Learn book that John Shook wrote based on his experience in Toyota in Japan describes a lot of the features of the A3 process in addition to A3 creation. A3 creation is really sort of a small part of that. It's what all the stuff that Porter learns to do and learns to understand about how the process works, and the coaching, frankly, that he gets from Sanderson, his manager. It's a good way to get an insight into the roles and responsibilities in the A3 process and the multi-dimensional nature of the process. As I tried to show in that graphic, there are so many things going on in the A3 process.
Another question, David, is from Greg. So he's heard about the parent-child A3 relationship. What does that refer to?
Cascading A3s. I sometimes referred to, and I don't like this, the mother A3 and the baby A3s. I much more prefer the parent A3, or whatever term Greg used. But the concept is there. They are cascading A3s. The top level sets the strategic perspective and the goals necessary to achieve that strategy, deploys responsibility for the individual goals to the next level, generally the department or functional level. At the functional level, they make plans for how to achieve the goals they've been given responsibility for. Generally, those achievements are then deploy responsibility to different units and different individuals for figuring out the means to achieve those goals. That's the cascading process. And it works whether it's Hoshin planning or project management.
Another question from Julissa is, how do you actually engage managers in the A3 process?
It, again, needs two things. It needs some purposeful business-related performance improvement reason for doing the A3 process to be defined as essentially an organizational development strategy, a way to drive performance improvement in the organization. And as I said earlier, ideally the people who are setting the strategy know what they're asking of the people below. If not, then the next level of management has to take on the responsibility to become educated, become familiar, become capable of doing A3s and coaching A3s.
Tom asks a question: how does the reflection A3 differ from the check and adjust steps of the PDCA process?
It doesn't. Between check and seeing what you accomplished and how you accomplished it, and differences between what you accomplished and what you expected to, and what you did and what you planned to do, the reflection step is looking at why those differences and why things worked, and summarizing that and using that as a basis for deciding how to adjust, whether you're going to standardize what worked, whether you're going, or continue problem solving on things that didn't work, or change your planning process, your execution process, because you may have missed things. It's essentially out of the reflection comes the learning that you build into the next cycle, which is what Mr. Cho very succinctly pointed out to me that I hadn't done.
So maybe, David, just 2 quick questions. So Sujay asks whether the A3 process can be used to solve all kinds of problems, be it a simple one versus a complex one. When should we use it?
If you look at strategy, execution, strategy making, and strategy execution, it's essentially a problem-solving process. Where are we now? What are the demands on us? We're not, excuse me, capable of handling. What are we going to do to try to develop our capability to be able to meet these new demands or to improve the performance of what we've got now? That's a problem-solving process. That deploys down. So every level is problem-solving.
And final question, David, is how often should one do PDCA, and how does one know whether you've reached the best version of an A3?
Well, I'll answer the second first. There is no perfect A3. There will never be an A3 that somebody couldn't have a suggestion about how it might be better. And when you look at it later on, you will probably see ways it's better. An A3 is finished when the stakeholders agree to the countermeasures and agree to take responsibility on to execute those countermeasures. When then you can use it as a tool to manage and track what you're doing to achieve the results that you want, and use it as a tool to do the check and to do the reflection and decide how to proceed to the next cycle. And I've forgotten what the first part was.
How often should one do PDCA?
Well, I think we do it all the time. At the very basic level, we do things, we say things, and it's going to be, we expect them to have a certain outcome, and they don't always have the outcome. And that is a point, I think, that we should do some basic PDCA, personal PDCA. Had a colleague who essentially had to drive about 45 minutes to an hour to get home from the plant where he was working, and he made it his practice to reflect. What did I do today that didn't turn out like I thought it was going to, and what do I understand about why, and how can I use what I understand to maybe not step in that next time?
Thanks, David. So just to wrap up, just want to share some information. So I've received a lot of questions about whether we can have access to the slides. So what David intends to do is to take each of those 7 lessons that he shared today, and he will write a lean post, which is an article from the LEI that is sent out to its members once every 2 weeks with additional explanation on each of those lessons. So please be on the lookout for that. And if you've not if you're not subscribed to the Lean Post, please go to lean.org and you should be able to subscribe to the Lean Post. If you're interested in learning more about the A3 process and deepen your skills, David is also offering a workshop on this. It's a virtual workshop over a 3-month period starting in July. And you can find more details of this on the screen here. So thank you everybody for joining. We understand that we could not answer all of your questions, but hopefully we will go through all of them and also try to address in some of the posts that David writes about. So thank you everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you.